right. We've got a good amount of people out there in the audience. I see about 36 of you all. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie Fields Cruz. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the executive director at Black Public Media. I just want to say that I am a dark brown skinned woman wearing blue glasses. I have on some red lipstick, and I'm wearing a light blue shirt. And I will be your moderator for tonight's discussion. I want to tell you a little bit about Black Public Media. We are a nonprofit dedicated to supporting and uplifting narratives that explore the Black experience in America and throughout the African diaspora. As a national organization, we fund documentaries and immersive media about the Black experience, and that work has premiered on PBS and is shown on publications such as The Guardian. Two projects that we've supported that I think relate directly to this topic include Going Back to T-Town, which was a 1993 documentary by Sam Pollard. Yes, Black Public Media was looking into this way back in 1993. Red Massacres VR, that looks at race massacres in various cities around the United States through an immersive lens, and Descendant from the Promised Land by Nayla Jefferson, that was featured on our Afropop digital shorts. You can go to our YouTube channel and watch it. It's streaming there as we speak. But tonight, again, we're going to focus on the Tulsa Race Massacres, one of the most horrific incidents of racial violence in American history. In 1921, the thriving Black community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, was systematically destroyed by a white mob. Hundreds of Black residents were murdered, homes and businesses were burned to the ground, and survivors were left without resources or recourse. The recently released 2025 Department of Justice report is the first, and I'm going to say this again, the first comprehensive federal examination of this atrocity. It acknowledges the massacre's devastating impact and highlights the legal avenues that could have been pursued had today's laws been in place in 1921. You will all have an opportunity to ask questions near the end of the webinar, but if you are so moved and you want to ask your question, just drop it in the Q&A and we will get to it at the end of our discussion. During the webinar, we are going to explore topics such as the panelists' contributions to the report, the significance and the timeliness of the report, and the potential for further accountability from the city of Tulsa and, dare I say, from the United States of America. So tonight, I am pleased and thankful to be able to welcome our guests to this discussion, who have contributed significantly to the understanding of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I will start with Victor Luckerson, who is a journalist and author working to bring neglected Black history to light. His book on Tulsa's Greenwood district, Built from the Fire, received numerous awards. Victor is currently a national correspondent for the Smithsonian Magazine. Victor, would you please share a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, thanks so much, Leslie, and to Black Public Media. I have to say, since you referenced going back to T-Town, I actually used the transcripts from those interviews as part of my research. So I actually have a quote from the interviews with Mabel Little and other Greenwood residents and sort of help bring their stories to more life. But I will not be able to do that without your work on that documentary. So just, I think seeing those connections we all have and telling this story is really valuable. But yeah, I'm Victor. I'm a journalist and now historian working on bringing Black history to light. I actually lived in Tulsa for about 5 years working on this project Built from the Fire about Greenwood. And honestly, sort of the impetus for really diving into this history for me was I visited Greenwood on a reporting trip in 2018 on the 97th anniversary of the Race Massacre, May 31st, 2018. And at that time, I was really struck by how much this history is being ignored in the city of Tulsa. There was a vigil happening on that anniversary in Greenwood, on this land where Black folks had been murdered. But there were maybe only about 30 people or so at this vigil, while there were hundreds of other people in the neighborhood going to a baseball game. There's actually a minor league baseball stadium in Greenwood right now. Takes up a lot of space, and that baseball game is taking up more precedence in people's minds, and then this horrific history. And so for me, having sort of had that experience in my very first trip to Tulsa really sort of keyed me into the fact that elevating this history and being more honest and open about it is really, really important. So I lived in Tulsa for several years working on the book. And we tried to highlight the stories of some of the families who lived in Greenwood or impacted by the massacre. I was really privileged to be able to speak with Ms. Bruner about her family and her ancestor, Mary Jones Parrish, a very vital truth teller who you're going to hear more about very soon. And so, for me, it's really been important to tell this story, not only in a way that highlights the horrific events that happened, but also elevates the human beings who are part of it. And so that's just a little bit about me. And I look forward to talking a little bit more about this very important DOJ report in the next half hour and a half. So thanks so much for having me.
Great. Thanks, Victor. All right, let me move on to Lisa A. Fanning, who is a genealogist and family historian, and she spent 30 years unraveling her family's American history with a focus on the histories of enslavement and migration. Lisa also volunteers her expertise for initiatives like the Tulsa Race Massacre DNA Identification Project. Lisa, please share some more about your work and your connection.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you, everyone, for being here, all of you in the audience, and for inviting me to be on this panel of such esteemed panelists. So yes, as Leslie said, I am a genealogist. I'm a genetic genealogist and family historian, and I've spent the last 30 years honing my research skills by unraveling the rich tapestry of my family's history in America, in the South and Midwest. And as a genetic genealogist, I do volunteer my expertise for groundbreaking initiatives such as the DNA Doe Project, and as you said, the Tulsa Race Massacre DNA Identification Project, which we'll talk about this evening. Also the DNA Search Squad. So I'm using DNA and genealogy research to help identify the unidentified. And I'm also an elected member of the board of directors of the National Genealogical Society and serve on the leadership team of the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute.
Wow. Well, again, welcome and very glad to have you on this panel. And now let me move to Anneliese Bruner, who I have to say is the reason why we are all here together. It was her brainchild to bring us together for this panel during the UN Forum. So Anneliese is a writer, editor, and advocate for historical literacy in the name of her ancestor, Mary Jones Parrish. She partnered in the successful 2020 publication of The Nation Must Awake, her great-grandmother's narrative of surviving the Tulsa Massacre. Anneliese, please share more about your work on this, as well as your work as a writer and editor on other publications.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Thanks so much again to Black Public Media and to our co-sponsor, Trinity University Press, who was responsible for bringing forward The Nation Must Awake, the republication on the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. As you've mentioned, this has been a lifelong, almost, project for me. I grew up not knowing anything about the Tulsa Race Massacre, not knowing anything about my great-grandmother, not even her name. My father grew up in Tulsa, but he left for college when he was 18 and never moved back. He moved to San Francisco, where I was born and where my family lived. My father gifted the book that my great-grandmother wrote when I was in my 30s. He gave it to me. And so I had lived all those years without an inkling of this information that is so vital and that we'll be exploring tonight. The thing that really motivates me about this is making sure that my ancestor, a woman, Mary Jones Parrish, gets her historic due as the person who first, in June of 1921, amidst all the destruction, went around and very bravely collected these stories, these oral histories, as we call them today, of folks when this was fresh in their minds. Despite their grief and their loss, they were able to collect themselves enough to know that this was important for posterity. And I'm grateful to her, and I want to make sure that her legacy is recognized.
Thank you, Anneliese. And for those of you, I have read the book, I have gifted the book, and it is truly eye-opening and heart-wrenching for those of us who have that connection to Tulsa. So let's dive in right now. I have some questions for all of y'all. But first, really, I'd love to hear each of you speak more specifically about your unique way that you've contributed to the Department of Justice report. And why don't we go ahead and start with you, Lisa? Oh, you're muted.
That always happens. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, so sure. I was part of the team of genetic genealogists who identified Mr. C.L. Daniel, who was the first Tulsa Race Massacre victim to be identified through the Tulsa Graves Investigation in July of last year. The city of Tulsa launched the Tulsa Graves Investigation to help find answers from the massacre. To do this, the city has convened individuals with expertise in different fields to help locate, identify, and connect people today with those who were lost more than 100 years ago. So we did not directly contribute to the DOJ report, but Mr. Daniel's name was included in the report, and we were responsible for identifying him. Our work was really deeply rooted in both science and storytelling. Really, we began with remains that had no name, just fragments of history, both biological and archival. But through DNA analysis and careful genealogical research, we were able to build something profoundly human out of those fragments. So in 2022, the first bone and teeth samples were sent to the DNA lab, Intermountain Forensics, which is now DNA Labs International, for DNA extraction and sequencing. And then in 2023, the investigative genetic genealogy work began on the first profiles that were available. And then just last year in July, we identified Mr. C.L. Daniel. So for me, this work goes beyond science. It's about restoring dignity. Mr. C.L. Daniel is no longer unknown. His family now knows who he was, what happened to him, and that his life mattered. His name is now part of the official record, part of a national reckoning that, while overdue, is essential. And so the process really highlights how modern tools can help uncover long-buried truths. And it also shows the power of collaboration between scientists, researchers, genealogists, historians, descendants, communities, and local and federal institutions to recover stories that were almost lost to silence. So far, we've been able to exhume 8 burials and have genetic profiles for those individuals, which is quite an accomplishment for burials over 100 years old, and specifically for the amount of DNA that is degraded in that time. So from my unique perspective, the importance of this report lies in its ability to humanize the data, to lift individuals like C.L. Daniel out of anonymity and say, you were here and your story will be told, because we finally have the tools, the will, and the collective responsibility to confront this history honestly.
See, even I did
Yeah,
I wasn't
even you did it.
This is great, and this is fascinating because we know that, I guess even maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this would not have been possible because the technology wasn't there.
Yeah.
And now that the technology is there, are there are families from in Tulsa, but also sort of the Tulsa diaspora for the families that fled, like Anneliese's family, are they aware of this? Are they signing up to donate their DNAs to see if there's a match?
So we do have people donating, but we certainly need more. And part of the challenge is that some people are afraid to do it because they're putting their DNA into a public database. And sometimes when we reach out to people, they don't believe that they had an ancestor connected to Tulsa, and that maybe it's a scam or something like that. So we have outreach specialists, which I'm one of them also. We have a few on our team that sort of try to work with families to help them to understand that this is real. They are genetically related, and that we're going to work with them along the way to make sure that that we can get their DNA in the database, and we can compare to see how closely they related they are, because that's really the key. And then we can build trees and sort of figure it out. So really, I think it's continuously making the public aware of what we're doing, and having people come to our website and fill out a form. And it's not just, if they're genetically related. Sometimes people just have stories that will help us to connect people who are one of the victims. And sometimes they have photos, they have all types of things from that period that help us as genealogists and researchers to connect them. So if anything, I would say hopefully everyone on this in this panel, in this webinar, if they're interested, they can submit DNA. I'll give the information for the website later, and to tell everybody, because it's important. Because if we don't have people in the database, then we can't identify people, or it takes a much longer time. So,
all right. No, this is, I'm thinking that we could add something to what we have on our YouTube channel
yes.
with the Descendants of the Promised Land, just like information, go here to donate your DNA. That's definitely something I think we can do a little bit of help with that outreach.
Well, we would really appreciate it, because sometimes I think people think because they didn't grow up in Oklahoma or Tulsa or near there that they would not have a connection. But Mr. Daniel was from Georgia.
Wow.
So it was only because, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, it was because people donated or submitted their DNA that we started pinpointing those people to a small county in Georgia called Coweta, Georgia. And that's where it all began. And then we sort of figured out who's connected to all of those people, and eventually we came to him. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but yeah.
Okay.
But your help would
you.
be really helpful.
That's right. Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right, Victor, I'm going to come on over to you, and please share your unique work that contributed to the report.
Sure. So just to give a little bit more background about this report, the U.S. Department of Justice has, or most likely had now because of the shift in administration, a cold cases unit that investigates historic civil rights violations. And last year, this unit announced that they were going to investigate the Tulsa Race Massacre. This is something that had been pushed for pretty aggressively by Greenwood community leaders for several years. I think it was important to people in Greenwood to have the federal government provide a wider ranging analysis of what had happened here. The Tulsa courts ultimately failed to prosecute any of the perpetrators at the time of the massacre. And so I think it was important to have an outside party come in and examine everything. And so in October of last year, I interviewed with the DOJ investigators as an expert on the race massacre. And in particular, the thing that I was trying to emphasize and ultimately emphasized in their report was the culpability of institutions in Tulsa for the race massacre. There's been I think, ongoing misconception about what happened in Tulsa in 1921, revolving around this idea of the white mob and sort of idea people have in their heads of maybe lower class white people, or maybe even just men in Klan's robes running around causing a lot of mayhem and murder and what have you. But in fact, a lot of people in very powerful institutions were involved in the race massacre. And so the Tulsa Police Department actually deputized anonymous white men and gave them the authority to go hunt and kill black people. The National Guard imprisoned a lot of black people in internment camps during the race massacre and intimidated them with a machine gun. And the city leaders tried to steal Greenwood land afterwards and move black people further north. And so these are sort of aspects of the story that I emphasize a lot in my book. I really tried to follow sort of the thread of the institutional involvement in the massacre. 'Cause I felt like it really was and emphasized a lot in the way people think about the event, because again, it kind of often centers on unnamed, unruly white mobsters. And so the DOJ, when I interviewed with them, I sort of provided some of my own perspective on that and sort of some details about the role that police played, including names of specific officers who were involved in either deputizing members of the mob or participating in the destruction themselves. And so I think the report, as it was published, actually did a good job of diving into those details and again, kind of establishing that this was an institutional failure, not just a bunch of people who had hate in their hearts on an individual level. So that was really kind of the perspective I brought to it, and I was happy to see that the DOJ reflected that in its final report.
You know, it's I have to ask this quick question. As each of you speak, more questions are coming into my head, but do you think you'd be able to have that response now to the outside investigators? Would they be willing to explore it, the massacre from that institutional perspective?
I'd be quite doubtful of that.
Mm-hmm.
So as everybody on this call knows, there's been a lot of attacks on talking about history in an authentic way since the new administration came into power. And in particular, I know there was an executive order that President Trump enacted or signed, I think maybe in February, regarding education in America. And in particular, is sort of instructing K through 12 teachers to only teach, quote, patriotic education. And patriotic education was defined as education that shows that America has always and consistently only been moving towards betterment as a society and reaching towards our highest values over time. And I think the Tulsa Race Massacre disrupts that idea. You know, you can't sort of look at this
Mm-hmm.
event and say that America's always been getting better. America's never made mistakes. And so, you know, that executive order alone says that having a true, honest conversation about what happened there would not be possible in the current political environment. You know, I actually live in Washington, D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm getting a firsthand look at it. But I think it'd be much harder to
Mm-hmm.
have those kind of conversations here with the federal government right now.
Great. Thank you. All right, let me move on. Anneliese, share what your work has done or your great grandmother's work in her contribution to the report and that unique perspective.
Well, what happened was, just as Victor mentioned, there was a call last year by the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, that was headed at that time by Kristen Clark, that said, you know, people who are descendants, survivors, have information or perspectives about this, members of the community. I mean, it was a broad call. And to be honest, I just happened to see it toward the end of their work. And so hastily, I put together a package. I got a copy of the book. I wrote an extensive, lengthy letter to Attorney Clark and mailed it off, not knowing if this was going to have an effect at all or if anyone would ever see it. Would it go into a black hole? I had no idea. But by the time it became clear that the report was going to be issued in January of this year, which I was grateful for, because as Victor said, after the change in the administration, one doesn't know what may have happened. And so I'm not speaking for anyone, but if I were in that position as the Deputy Attorney General, I knew there was going to be a change in administration. I would have put on all speed to get this report out. So again, I'm not saying that that's what happened, but when I saw it, that it came out in January, I thought to myself, perhaps they were of a mind that this needed to be done as soon as possible before the change in administration. And I was pleased to see that not only was The Nation Must Awake cited, but throughout, Mary Jones Parrish as a primary source was named by name. And that was extremely important for me, not for vanity, but for posterity and true and accurate history, because some people are not aware that this woman was the first chronicler of this event in real time. And I want to make sure that that is known, acknowledged, recognized, and celebrated. And so that was very gratifying for me. And again, it was by happenstance that that I think that information came before them, and that I don't know if my quick action helped. Maybe they had the book already, but in any event, it was used, and I think that it enriched the characterization of all of these people as individuals, as both Lisa and Victor have said, it humanizes them. The stories from their very own mouths. And one thing I will say further is that we have to, I think, understand what a tenuous time this was. It wasn't just like, tra la 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 la, I'm going to go out and gather these stories. When you see pictures of the aftermath of this destruction, which, as Victor has said, was at an institutional level, and we find from the report at a military level, they say that up to between 8,000 and 10,000 may have been deployed into that community. And when we're talking about a community of 10,000 people, it's possible that it was a 1-to-1 ratio of invaders to community residents. Think about the level of an attack like that not only is aerial, ground, machine guns perched from high levels at the top of this granary near the Frisco station. That was the machine gun that was firing on what's called Deep Tulsa at Greenwood and Archer, where my family was living. My great-grandmother and my grandmother, who was 7 years old. And my great-grandmother describes running through a hail of bullets. Those would have been machine gun bullets. And when they got up farther north and were heading toward Standpipe Hill, where they thought they were heading toward a friend's home, Mrs. Thompson, they said, they ran into more gunfire. So this tells us that the community was surrounded, and all of these invaders really were stationed strategically around the community, and they were using tactics that they had learned in the Great War. And this is something that I'm sure Victor has more to say about, but this is something that we can't really fathom. It looks like Dresden, during World War II. That's the only way I can describe for folks who have not seen these images. It looks like Dresden. And I would have to say that going around and collecting stories in that kind of physical environment, the smell of things having burned, the nerves of the people that you're talking to cannot have been settled. There were people, and again, Lisa's talking about, the anonymity of some of the deceased who are being exhumed after all this time. But there's another application for the word. Some people would only speak to Mary Jones Parrish under conditions of anonymity. They were afraid to have their names used. They didn't want to be identified as having been part of this because there could have been retribution. The second thing that I'll say when we're talking about names, we look in the oral histories and we see these different names, and we see that they go by first and second initials and last names, which was common for Black people because they didn't want to be called Andrew by small children. So they were either Mr. Smitherman or AJ Smitherman or whatever the case might be. But what's even more profound in my mind is we know how we are always questioned about our patriotism. Victor mentioned that word when we're talking about, patriotic American history. But imagine this man, AJ Smitherman, his name was Andrew Jackson Smitherman. We loved, we were part and have always been part and have always wanted to be part. So these disingenuous and cruel questions to diminish our dedication to this country, I don't think people could have lived what we've lived through and be as devoted to this country as we are. So it's an insult, first of all. And he's not the only person. Dr. A.C. Jackson, who was basically, he was assassinated as he walked out of his home with his hands up. What was his name? His name was Andrew C. Jackson. Just think about this.
Mhm.
Think about this when you're thinking about a society where people look up to the president and say, I'm going to name my child after the president.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
to live through these things and and to live through, what was happening in the broader social context and to dare question people's patriotism.
Yeah,
It's a bitter pill.
very much so. Very much so. Um, as I think about the report, its release, and Anneliese, you mentioned you felt that maybe internally those that were at the Department of Justice at that time felt the urgency to release the report. Do you see will do you foresee any further accountability from the city of Tulsa or from others? I know I can share with everyone that right now public media PBS is under attack by the current administration, and one of the projects that they have listed as a problem project was a film called The Cost of Inheritance, which was about reparations to the Black community. And so, when we're talking about accountability, there's a lot of different ways in which the city of Tulsa can account for this. But do you foresee anything further? Any of you can answer that question, Anneliese, or all of you can.
I'll start on this
Mhm.
one. There's a new mayor in Tulsa, Mayor Nichols, the first African-American mayor ever in the history of Tulsa. He has declared June 1st as a special time to commemorate the massacre. And he has also begun to speak, however vaguely, there are constraints on people about reparations for survivors and descendants.
Mhm.
Put a pin in that. Beyond that, at the UN meeting where I was on Tuesday, reparations is actually a worldwide movement having to do with issues concerning, and I'm going to use some terminology that is maybe a bit different than what some people have been accustomed to using or hearing. And this is not, I'm not saying that I'm going to say something crazy. People have begun to reframe what we used to call the transatlantic slave trade as more a trafficking kind of situation. More, it's really more accurate. It's more sympathetic toward the humanity of those who were trafficked. We talk, of course, now about the enslaved or people who were enslaved, the people first, rather than slaves, because this does not describe people's humanity, their dreams, their aspirations, their potential. And so at the meeting where I was not the only person to mention the Tulsa Race Massacre. I think two other people did. And one person in particular talked about, the limitations on municipalities like Tulsa to really address this, even institutionally. It really is a much bigger issue than that. And so I won't say anything further. I'm not in Mayor Nichols' mind nor in his office. I don't know what's going to happen. He has put this forward as a potential program or initiative, I guess I should say. Victor may know more about it than I do.
No, Anneliese, you definitely summed it up really well. Mayor Nichols, I should also mention, I think for me, it was very striking to see Mayor Nichols, the first ever Black mayor elected in Tulsa. He's also a Democrat on the same day that President Trump was elected. And it kind of showed, I think, that everyone isn't moving in lockstep politically in this country all the time. There can be a sense, I think, sometimes that, the country is going in a direction a lot of people don't like, or there's nothing you can do about it. But even on an individual level, people will choose different kinds of leaders in different contexts. So there's always sort of a door being opened, even if one's being slammed shut. I think in terms of how the report plays into all this, this DOJ report outlined in a lot of detail the legal reality of trying to pursue reparations through the courts, and it's pretty remote, to be honest. Many doors have been tried. They've mostly been slammed shut. Three living survivors filed a lawsuit seeking reparations from the city of Tulsa in 2020. That case was dismissed by the Oklahoma Supreme Court last year. But I do think documents like the DOJ report can help create a new political reality. One of the historically in the United States, the best avenue for any forms of reparations has been through city councils and legislatures. In Florida, the Rosewood Massacre, you may be familiar with, there was a massacre in Rosewood, Florida, in 1923. Smaller in scale, but somewhat similar dynamics to the Tulsa Race Massacre. And the Florida legislature actually provided reparations, cash payments to those survivors in 1994, actually. And so that wasn't through the courts, that was through politics. And so one of the arguments that succeeded politically in Florida at that time was the idea that Florida police officials, the governor of Florida, other official entities had failed to protect their own citizens. And I think this DOJ report kind of re-emphasizes that argument. And so I think having reports like this that are, again, from outside groups, unbiased groups, sort of saying the same thing that people with a stake in the game have been saying for a very long time, they kind of reinforce the arguments. And I think in this case, the DOJ report could help to shape the political reality of what Mayor Nichols may try to pull off in Tulsa with his city council. So I think this kind of thing, even if it doesn't mean that the DOJ is going to arrest someone or levy some kind of civil penalty, it does sort of open up avenues for political players to have, I think, a better chance of providing some sort of justice for massacre survivors and their descendants.
Yeah, and I can only speak specifically to the work we're doing. I believe the information that has been long hidden from the descendants, such as the names of their loved ones killed and burial locations, should be recovered where possible. And so the city's Tulsa Graves Investigation and our genealogy work are entirely dedicated to finding that information. And that is exactly what we were able to do last year for the Daniel family.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Great. So, well, we talked a little bit. I'll just go right into it. We know that the current administration is scrubbing certain things from the Department of Justice website and from various websites. I actually didn't get a chance to check to see if the report was still there. Does anybody know? Is it still there? It is still there.
I check fairly often, and it is still there. It just may not have been found yet. I suggest download it. I have downloaded my copy already. And anybody who's on this call, I would suggest that you go and get yourself a copy and download it post haste.
Do you all think that this is a model, or at least the report can be used in application to other areas where there were race massacres around the United States, either against Black communities, but perhaps Indigenous communities as well? I'm not sure if it's to spark a further investigation, but also maybe to use it as a way to explore issues around accountability and reparations. Anyone can take that question.
I can respond. So I do think that, I actually learned a lot from the report in terms of the laws that were on the books in 1921 that could have been prosecuted and were not, and also the laws that exist today. And so the report does a really great job of, for example, of describing the history of hate crime laws and what sort of existed at the time versus what's around today. And also, even at the time, though, there were laws on the books in America regarding police accountability, believe it or not. And so those laws were not enforced, but there were laws at the time that sort of said that if a police officer or government entity infringes on the rights of a citizen, they can be found liable or responsible in some kind of way. And so I think having those legal frameworks explained in a really clear manner is really valuable. And I also think, kind of going back to the drum I've been beating, kind of recontextualizing a lot of these massacres around institutional
Mhm.
responsibility as opposed to bad actors, or sort of rogue agents. Or, for example, a lot of times we get fixated on the relationship between a black man and a white woman as a spark. But for example, in my work with the book, I actually didn't spend very much time on this story about Dick Rowland and Sarah Page, this black man and white woman who were in an elevator, and their incident between them sort of sparked everything. I didn't want to spend time on that because it felt like a distraction from the institutional responsibility of what happened. And so I think the framing of the report, I think, offers a chance to kind of reframe how I think about these historical events in a way that can get us towards ideas of restorative justice today, because those institutions that were responsible in 1921 in Tulsa, but across the country during the Red Summer of 1919, often still exist in these different communities.
Lisa, again, this is a side question. You talked a little bit about how you were able to marry the genealogy research also with story. Are there, we might have some storytellers out there in the audience. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of these stories and how they do make make our ancestors real, and how that could be used in further investigations or connected to reparations?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important. DNA is just science. It's analysis. It's very clinical. You really don't have to know a lot about this story to figure out all the time, like who's related to whom. And but the story is what really builds the context. And sometimes when you have that, it does help you to sort of like think about things like migration and about history and what was happening at the time. And in the case of Anneliese's great grandmother or grandmother, really being able to describe what that was like. I mean, that sort of really kind of it immediately takes you to thinking about what the situation was, as opposed to just reading about it. Those individual stories, it kind of connects to you in a different way. And I think there more people should be involved in wanting to tell the stories of Tulsa. I think it's been hard. It's been really hard, and I think I only learned about it in 2021 when it was like the anniversary. Like I didn't know anything about Tulsa Race Massacre. And I'm almost 50, I'm 57 years old. So that was just a few years ago. And it was just shocking. And so I think all of what people are, we're all connecting to this in different ways. And this opportunity allows us to tell our story about it. But I think there could be many more people telling the story of Tulsa from many different angles, however they connect to it. Storytelling really helps people to imagine and really get in the feel, the situation that person was in, and how they must have felt. And I think it propels people to do more and to learn more and share more. And that's what we all need for this story to stay alive. Anneliese talked about downloading the DOJ report post haste, and I was just going to basically say that one of the main tenets of the field of genealogy is that we preserve information for generations to come. And so, the Greenwood community and many other individuals and organizations have worked tirelessly to document and keep the history alive. And our project really just contributes information to these, longstanding initiatives. But when we reported on this new burial and we identified C.L. Daniel, that information reached outside of Tulsa as well. And so that news was carried around the world. And so that means it'll be preserved in archives globally. C.L. Daniel's file at the National Archives has now been digitized, and so it will always be there. There's another digital library called the Wayback Machine, where it sort of archives internet sites that are submitted. So that's another place where that information can be held. There's lots of blogs and science journals, forensic journals, archaeology journals that have written about the project. And so, I think, aside from whether or not it's going to be on a government site, this story, at least, as it continues to unfold, because we hope to identify more victims, and the whole story of Tulsa can be preserved outside of, a government website. And I would just encourage people to, contact their elected official, to also use genealogy outlets like findagrave.com, which is a database of records for the world cemeteries. There's familysearch.org, which is a free website where you could actually upload a PDF of the DOJ report. You can add stories, photos, and they even have a place where you can do audio clips. So Anneliese is someone that would be a great thing for you to submit. And then there's, public ancestry trees, there's WikiTree, there's family history blogs. So I think that while it feels horrible to think that your own government wouldn't, continue to keep such an important document of history, there's just other ways we have to go around that and make sure that, Tulsa is not forgotten.
Yeah, I really and truly believe that we need to ensure we have to protect our stories. We need to ensure that they are accessible. And if that means that it needs to be in more more than just one place, then we need to make sure that that happens, because we cannot, if you're putting everything all in one place, it's at risk at being erased in case someone's just decided, well, we're not going to, we don't want these stories anymore. So
if I could just interject here, I've had trouble finding my my grandfather's World War II service, because it wasn't sabotage. There was a terrible fire at the archives, and military records for a certain period were destroyed, and anything can happen. So it's not just, oh, the boogeyman might be after you. It's also, you need to disperse the sources so that if a disaster happens, these stories are protected. I've actually sent some books to folks overseas whom I know, and it's just a matter of sometimes happenstance.
And even capturing like if there's a physical artifact, taking the photograph, digitizing it, uploading it, and to protect it. That's really, really important. All right. It's at 6:53. We've got time. I would love to open up the floor, questions to the audience. If you want to use the Q&A, you can.
Leslie, can I just say one thing before we go to questions?
Sure.
I just wanted to talk about that the work that we're doing will continue regardless. There's many pro bono genealogy partners to identify the burials, and I just wanted to name them because a lot of times the work we do is kind of behind the scenes, and I know some of them are on the call today, so I just wanted to talk about some of those partners. There's the Cold Case Coalition, there's the Intermountain Forensics, which I talked about, the DNA Doe Project, which does a lot of work to identify the unidentified, Moxie Forensics, DNA Detectives, Identifiers International, and DNA Labs International. And so I just wanted to, I'm one of a big body of people who's doing this work. So I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge the work that they're doing to help identify the victims.
Great. If you are there in the audience and you have links to share, please just drop them in the chat so that everyone can pull them up on their own. Please do.
And if I could just ask Victor, can you tell us a little bit about the projects that you're working on now? Because I know you have some other things in the hopper that sound just as fascinating, if that's possible, as your Tulsa work. I have to say, the book that Victor has written, it's poetry. He is a magnificent writer, and he brings the stories to life. He brings the people to life. He brings the community to life, and his insights and his vision just infuse the community and the characters with so much reality and viability. It's just a wonderful read. It's a dense book and it's very long, and you can tell that he poured a lot of effort into it. I can't speak to that effort, but Victor, if you could just tell us a little bit about A, your process, and B, what you're working on now, I would be so grateful. And please, I can say, please get Victor's book. It is a masterpiece. And is being used in academia now. It deservedly so. The notes, the indices, it's flawless. Just a beautiful book.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Bruner. I appreciate that. And yeah, when y'all look this book up, you're gonna see it's like 600 pages. Don't be too scared because about 150 pages are just footnotes. So it's long, but it's not that long. You just asked about my process. It really was kind of what we've been centering on today, trying to make a human-driven story that was really about the narratives of real people. I mean, just for me, for example, I noticed in my research that Events of the Tulsa Disaster, the original version of Mary Jones Parrish's book, was cited in many, many sources, but no one ever said much about who she actually was as a person. And so for me, it was important in my book to actually talk about her and her daughter and the experiences she had, capturing these stories when it would have been extremely dangerous. And so the book is in some ways about the truth tellers of Greenwood over time. And so I'm just really fortunate to be able to work with folks like Ms. Bruner to make sure that these stories came to light in an honest and authentic way. The other thing I can say on that point, I think is important and kind of I think about, again, how we're all kind of connected in our work. So I travel around the country a lot talking about my book at colleges, and I encounter teachers quite often asking me, how can I teach this history today? What can I do amidst this backlash of teaching authentic history? And I very often bring up The Nation Must Awake, the modern version of Mary Jones Parrish's book, because I think it's much harder to argue against primary sources, actually. And so I think, for teachers who might be on the call or anybody trying to figure out how to sort of navigate these waters we're in, being able to use primary sources like the ones that Mary Jones Parrish captured, I think it's really vital. And it becomes, again, much harder to counter argue compared to whatever quote unquote agenda journalists might have. You can't really argue with these first-hand accounts from people that Miss Parrish captured. In terms of what I'm doing next, so actually, I have an email newsletter called Run It Back. And for a long time, it was kind of where I would sort of write about my Oklahoma research and kind of provide updates on what I was doing. But I've kind of repurposed it now to be actually about a broader survey of Black history, sort of small vignettes every 2 weeks about Black history, but also making sure that it's digestible in a way that can be used in educational format. And so these articles I'm writing, kind of filling in some of the gaps of Black history for readers, but also they're sort of written in such a way that if a teacher wanted to use them for a class, they could be used for that purpose. I think that one of the things we have to really focus on right now, as storytellers, as truth tellers, is creating alternative infrastructures for sharing our information. That happened in 1921. We haven't talked about this much, but the white press and white leaders tried to create an alternate reality of what happened very, very quickly.
Yeah.
The white press in Tulsa said that quote unquote bad Negroes are responsible. And even the federal investigators of the time downplayed the destruction of the event and downplayed the culpability of white institutions. And so it was only through groups like the Black Press in Oklahoma and through individuals like Mary Jones Parrish, whose book was crowdfunded actually. She actually had people in the community raising money to get that book published. That's why we were able to have this actual truth being told. And so I think right now it's our responsibility to create some alternative infrastructure for spreading the truth, because we cannot expect the government to do that for us at this point.
Sometimes we have to look back at what our ancestors did to get the word out and find, those methods and and bring them up into a modern context. We've talked a lot about at Black Public Media, you know, if we are unable to distribute some of our stories via public media, well, how do we get it out to communities? And if you're familiar with Oscar Micheaux, he just took those films right on out into the communities and he screened them in those communities. So those are some of the ways that you look to the past in order to inform the present and how to share and get the word out. I was gonna save that question about what people are working on next for after the Q&A, but that's okay. We can go ahead. I'll ask Lisa, what are you working on and what's upcoming for you? And then after we get through everybody, then I'll go to the floor and get the questions answered.
Yeah, so I will continue with the work that I'm doing with the Tulsa Project. We're excited that the Tulsa, the new mayor, Monroe Nichols, will assume leadership of the Tulsa Graves Investigation now. And so we'll just continue trying to identify victims. On a personal note, I'm co-presenting with a historian at the National Genealogical Society Conference next month in Louisville, Kentucky. And we'll be talking about the journeys of our ancestors who were both enslaved and forced to labor at the same iron plantation in Tennessee in the early 1800s, and about what happened to their descendants, which I'm one of those. And so it should be a really interesting presentation because when most people think about what people did during slavery, they think about cotton, they think about rice, they think about tobacco, but they don't think about iron. And as Anneliese was saying, you know, you grow up not knowing about the lives of your ancestors, and then you learn, and it's like, whoa. And that's what happened to me. So I had to do a deep dive into iron plantations. So yeah, build awareness and talk about my ancestors' role in, you know, industrializing this nation, even though they were enslaved. And so I'm going to be doing that next month. I'm very excited because it's my first sort of public presentation about my ancestor, and then to really talk about what happened to his descendants. I think it's going to be nice for people to see that we're still here and we're doing our thing. So
okay, all right. Any documentarians out there? You got stories right here. Come on. All right, Anneliese, please talk about what you're working on and what's upcoming for you. I know a little bit, but go ahead.
Sure. Before I do that, I have to get back a little bit to Victor talking about crowdfunding for books. I have one of the original events of the Tulsa disaster. I know where about 4 or 5 others are. I don't know of the original run, which we think 25 maybe were printed. I don't know where they are or if they even still exist. Some of the books themselves have very interesting stories. And I'm going to talk about 2 aspects of that. The first one, Victor, you mentioned Mabel Little. Well, when Mary Jones Parrish was crowdfunding the book, there's in the original version, not in the reprinted Nation Must Await, but in the original version, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, there are ads in the back of the book. And one of the ads is for Mabel Little's hair salon. And Mabel Little, for anyone who knows anything about the Tulsa community, she was a stalwart of the community and very central in preserving the memory of this story and pivotal in the history of Mount Zion Baptist Church. And so to see Mabel Little's card in the back of Mary Jones Parrish's book, and to see Mary Parrish in the book talking about Mr. Bauman, and seeing in the list of losses, you know, his name in there. This was a tight-knit and very interwoven and mutually dependent community. These people worked together and they had one another's back. And so that's one thing that is a lesson from the past. And then I'll go on to, in terms of the book, what the other lever was that I wanted to mention, which is the book, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, has its own life. I have written a screenplay about the book, not about the story of the massacre, but about the book itself. That to me is inspired by The Red Violin, a movie that Sam Jackson was in about this violin that was made, I think, in like the 17th century or something, and it has this really rich history. And for me, this book has a very rich history. And so the book itself, oddly enough, is the protagonist of this story that I've written, the screenplay for. And I'm in the process now. I just completed it earlier this month. I worked on it for about 5 or 6 weeks, like nonstop. And I'm in the process of marketing it right now for either optioning or for a workshop. And so crowdfunding.
Yes. Yes. But, you know, there's also some producers that I could introduce you to. All right. So let's get to some questions. We have someone asks, are you all working with Justice for Greenwood that works to identify descendants of massacre victims? I think that might be for Lisa or Victor.
Greenwood as a descendant.
Yeah, it's a separate organization. We're definitely know who they are. We haven't collaborated with them yet. We started, you know, a couple years ago. That I know that we work with them. Justice for Greenwood. Yeah, we do work with Justice for Greenwood. What am I saying? Yes, we do work with them. I don't work with them directly, but our leaders do work with them. I think we're doing a workshop with them this month at the community center. So, you know, we have to be aware of what's going on. They need to be aware of what we're doing, because it doesn't make sense to not have the left hand and the right hand know what's happening, because we're all working towards the same goal. So we are aware of them, and we do work with them on certain projects.
I could just add, I don't work with them directly. You know, as a journalist, I'm a little bit I stay out of the fray, so to speak. But Justice for Greenwood, they've had a major role in the sort of pursuit of justice in Greenwood for the last several years. This group is the group that actually spearheaded the lawsuit I mentioned by the living survivors of the massacre. And they've also done a lot of work of reconnecting the descendant community. Every year on the anniversary of the race massacre in Tulsa, there's a lot of events that happen. And there's one event is that they have an event with massacre descendants where they get to kind of get reconnected, get updated about the legal fights and that kind of thing. So they've been really, really important, I think, in this legal fight in Tulsa over the last several years.
That's great. All right, this question is coming from Alita Williams. It's for Anneliese. Can you tell us about any other projects or ways in which you will ensure your great-grandmother gets her earned recognition?
Well, actually, it's back to the story that I've just written, and to be a little bit more detailed about it, because that was a pretty high level description. It really is a story not only of the Little Red Book, but also how that grew and evolved into The Nation Must Awake. And it's a series of very serendipitous events. Things could have gone in either direction at pivotal inflection points, and this whole thing wouldn't have happened. And so it's kind of, there's some tension. We all know how it comes out, obviously, but at the same time, it's just the humanity of where you are in the moment when you're trying to get something done, and it seems that things are against you, or, and how, people are able to overcome with perseverance. It sounds a bit trite, but we all experience that. And it's bigger than what's happening to one person, because this is a story that is a universal story, and it needs to be it has a life that needs to be fed. And I'm trying to feed it so that it comes to its full fruition. And so that's my purpose right now. The first one was to get that project in 2021, that Centennial Project. And now it's to turn it in, it's like a book to a film to a book, because after I get the film aspect of it in place, I actually do want to write a more detailed story, because there's really a lot more that I'm able to fit into 90 to 100 pages, i.e. 90 to 100 minutes, as you know, Leslie, what that means when somebody says 90 to 100 pages. So I limited it to 100 minutes. You know, I tried for 90, I couldn't get it, but I got to 100, and I was able to stop at 100 pages, but there still is a lot more to the story. So I'm envisioning another book, but it's not, again, not the story of the race massacre. It's a story of people.
Okay. All right. This question, it's actually coming from Bayate Ross Smith, who is actually the creator of Red Massacres VR, which is one of Black Public Media's funded projects. And he asks, any suggestions and best practices for strategies on sharing these stories and keeping this history alive, combined with accessible resources we can or should share?
I always think it's important to get young people involved in whatever you're doing, because they are going to be the generations that continue the story. And young people today have a completely different way of communicating, of sharing information, of absorbing information. So I think being able to have them be involved in this is going to really be key, because they just use TikTok. They don't read books. I mean, not that all young people don't read books, but a lot of them, get a lot of information from TikTok. They might learn about a book through TikTok, right? So Victor's book should be heavily on TikTok. Maybe it is, but having people talk about it, young people talk about it, talk about Anneliese's book, talk about why DNA is important to submit for a project like ours. Because it doesn't matter. I mean, whether they're young. I mean, the people living today that would be related to the Tulsa Race Massacre victims, it's like about 3 to 5 generations, and we still can figure out from young people, how they're maybe related to victims. So just taking what we've done so far and kind of spreading it further, but especially hitting that young generation, I think will be very helpful.
I agree.
One thing I would add, having sort of spent a lot of time talking to young people over the last couple of years on college visits and high school visits about my book, I think that finding frames to talk about these issues that don't center on trauma is really important. I think young Black folks are kind of sort of tired of a trauma narrative. They kind of feel like they've absorbed a lot of that from society for a very long time. And they kind of feel like they kind of know that story. Even if they don't know the whole story, they kind of feel like they do. And so I think you have to find a different frame to talk about these kind of things. So for example, I remember when I was still working on the book, I did a sort of preliminary presentation with one of my friends who teaches 7th graders. So I talked to 7th graders about my book and about Greenwood. And the first question was, what were they wearing back in the day? That's what they wanted to know. They wanted to know what the style was of Greenwood folks in the 1910s. I was just speaking to some high school students a couple of weeks ago in Kansas, and I sort of had them play this guessing game where I showed photos of the Greenwood folks like A.C. Jackson, who we mentioned, Lula Williams, and they got to guess what their occupation was. And that kind of got them into a better state to want to engage with me when things got tougher. And so I think just finding ways to take these topics, which are so often anchored around trauma, and giving them a different perspective is really valuable. That's one reason I love what Anneliese has been bringing up about events of the Tulsa disaster in the Little Red Book, and just sort of making it a different framing of these events that's not just about this one horrific thing that happened, but also this beautiful creation that came out of that and that is still with us today. So I think just kind of finding those alternative framings for traumatic events, I think it's a really great way to have young people kind of be more open to receiving it.
And I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I agree with you, Victor, because I did a presentation at the college I work at And, they were much more fascinated by the science of DNA and also about just ancestry and being able to research, not just who your ancestors were, but what parts of the world they came from. So that's another way to kind of engage people with this story, because, once you take a DNA test, it's going to tell you your ancestral makeup. And so, it's sort of, you could look at, who people were in Tulsa at that time, what was their ancestral makeup. That might be fascinating for people. So, yeah.
Yeah. I can echo all of that. I work with young people in theater, and we up here where I live at Peekskill, they had a riot in the 1930s, and so the kids were like, "Okay, let's explore this," and they'll create their own short play. But it's probably going to be on misinformation that has a connection to today. But that's how they learn about what happened locally in their hometown. So, finding those different entry points for young people around this issue that can be very traumatic is important. That's how we can share those stories. Okay, I've got a question from Kevin Hurt. This is for Lisa. From a molecular standpoint, is DNA degradation posing a challenge for extracting DNA from hard tissue over 100 years old?
So I'm not a geneticist or anthropologist or archaeologist, but we do work with them. So my response is going to be based on sort of what I've read or heard through our process. We have had to do a couple of runs of DNA extraction for some of our victims because it was just really degraded, right? But for the most part, the bodies that or the remains that have been exhumed, we have been able to create a genetic profile for them, which then allows us to upload the DNA. We can only use 2 sites, FTDNA, which is family tree DNA, and GEDmatch. That's where we put the DNA of the victims. We're not able to do that for the other companies. The companies have to agree to that kind of thing. And so FTDNA, that we can only work with the people who have submitted DNA to that pool. And then with GEDmatch, anyone can upload their DNA to that. So that just expands the number of people who are related to the victims. And one of my colleagues sort of posted that in the chat to have people upload to GEDmatch because that allows us to see more people. But yeah, I mean, it's a problem, but we try to overcome it as much as we can. And for the most part, we've been able to get the DNA from the victims. Yeah.
Okay. There's I think another question here about GEDmatch since we're on it, and maybe you answered it, but I'm going to ask it. They wanted to know, should people upload their data to GEDmatch when there has been some pushback from some genealogists about using GEDmatch, and some are urging not to use the site?
Yeah, I mean, there's always controversies around everything, and GEDmatch is no exception. It's a public database, and there was a time when law enforcement was using GEDmatch to identify, killers, murderers, like people who committed crimes, if their DNA was left at a site. And when that was discovered, then GEDmatch separated the site so that when you upload your DNA to GEDmatch, you determine whether or not you want your DNA to be open to law enforcement or closed. And a lot of people don't know that. It's very much a part of, what the process you go through when you're uploading. So I mean, I think if it concerns you, yeah, I mean, you shouldn't do something you don't want to do, but there are controls in place. And ultimately, we can't do our work if we don't have DNA. Like we cannot identify, 100-year-old remains if we don't have individuals. But you control the whole thing. It's up to you. if you want to be on that side of GEDmatch where you allow people, law enforcement or others to see your DNA, if you're related to someone or you don't. So we appreciate when people don't want to do that because, you know, that's their right. And we're also very, you know, grateful when people do because it helps our efforts. So yeah, I think it's an individual, you know, it's an individual decision, and I can understand, you know, the concern. I have my DNA in all of them, so you know, I just it's more important for me to be able to find people and people to find me, and you know, there's nefarious things happening all the time, but I think that, you know, it's as safe as it can be. Yeah.
All right. This question is for Anneliese. Was your grandmother part of the Seminole or Creek freedmen community, and were there other freedmen victims of the massacre?
There are people who are descendants who do claim their freedmen status and are enrolled tribal members. My family is Creek, but on my father's other side, my father's father's side, are all descended from the Creek Nation. And my father was born in Wowoka, which is the capital of the Seminole Nation. And but we are not tribal members. But we are descended on that part of my father's heritage from the Creek Nation.
Okay. And this question is coming from the US Freedmen Project. As a New York reparationist advocating against the Democrat legislator's race-based approach that erases the story of descendants of the families that survived slavery in the US, do you have any suggestions on how to center those stories through DNA, genealogy, and or other means? So that it's might be a question for Lisa since it has
yeah,
DNA.
can you yeah,
Can read it again?
you read it again? I'm just because I'm trying to think if I know something about I
Okay.
don't think I've heard about
It's a
this.
New York reparationist because they are doing a study around reparations here in New York, advocating against the Democratic legislators' race-based approach that erases the story of the descendants of the families that survived slavery in the US. Do you have any suggestions on how to center those stories through DNA, genealogy, and or other means?
Okay. I would have to think about that. I mean, I think because it sounds like what you're saying is how can they use DNA to for reparations? And I'm still struggling a little bit with
I think what they're saying is that this person is advocating against using a race-based approach that erases the story of the descendants of the families. So I wants to know if there are any other suggestions on how to center those stories through DNA, genealogy, and other means.
So not using race as a
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to me with DNA, you can derive a lot of information, right? So some of that is ancestry, which would then point, I guess, to race in some way if you believe in the construct of race. But I mean, it also can connect you to people. So if you know, I guess if you're trying to connect to people who are part of a body that somehow you know, would justify or verify or confirm something, then DNA can certainly be used to do that. I don't know if I've answered the question. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it. Maybe if they could sort of like clarify a little bit in the chat, then I could sort of work through a response. But I'm still, I've never heard that before, so I'm still sort of, I guess, chewing on it a little bit to know how to respond.
Okay.
And I don't know if anyone else.
Well, I have something that this prompts for me, which is, you know, we all know this, but there's a lot of times it's like taboo about mentioning it. But the group of people that we call African Americans, and I'm a proud Black woman, so this is not to try to erase my racial identity, whatever. But we're all related to to European Americans, and we know how that happened. And sometimes it puzzles me that people seem not to understand or want to understand about the fact that these DNA analyses that say, oh, you're part this and you're part that, you're this percentage this and you're this percentage that. There's hardly anyone of us in this country who have descended from the enslaved Africans who are to a greater or lesser degree also related to all of these Europeans in this country. And if that is what the person is asking about, and I guess that's not race-based. It's like if you're related to someone who was a property owner and who was enriched through whatever means, are you entitled to some of that inheritance, if any of it exists, or whatever the case might be? I mean, that's the only kind of interpretation that I can take from that. I don't know that that's what the person meant at all, but that thought was sparked in my mind because, I mean, who goes around saying, oh, well, I'm this and I'm that and I'm this and I'm that, particularly with, the climate that we have in this country around these issues. But let's just face it, we're all related here. Actually, not just like kumbaya brothers and sisters, but on a practical level. We're all related to these people, and the people who feel like however they feel toward us, okay, we're your blood relatives. Let's just spill that. Let's just spit it out. So what is all of this? But we know what it is, all of these social constructs. But I like to say not to erase my Black identity, but to say, we really are a really very dysfunctional and messed up family in this country.
Yeah, I agree, Anneliese, and it's I think probably if anybody watches Finding Your Roots, you hear Dr. Gates always talking about 30% of most African Americans have European ancestry, and that's just a fact. Some more, some less, but that's around the number, and it's a complicated story because what I'll say is in my own family, when I had my grandfather's brother's maternal DNA tested, we are African American to the core culturally. That's how we identify. I didn't know what was going to come out in the testing that, when we did the DNA test, where it would go, I know that my maternal line goes to Ghana. We descend from the God people of Ghana. That the DNA test tells me that. But my grandfather's maternal DNA is from the British Isles, which is a little atypical for African Americans in the sense that you can find African males who will have Y DNA that's European because of slavery. But when you have European maternal DNA, that's a different story. And it's the story of my grandfather or my grandfather's maternal ancestry. And I know who the woman was because I've done that research. And I know that at that time, there were a lot of indentured white servants that came to this country, and they had children with enslaved African men or African and Indian men. And those children were free because they were free. And that a whole nother community was born, not necessarily separate, but it you know, and so when our DNA is tested, my grandfather, who looks like a Black man, he has a white maternal ancestor that goes all the way back. And so when you think about that, like, you know, that's a completely different story. That's not a slavery story, right? Just like you have Creek ancestry. So we have multiple stories, and it does kind of, because we live in this country, which, you know, racism is part of our everyday existence. It makes it hard to really embrace everything. But ultimately, I will tell you that, you know, I know that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for all the people who came together, however they came together, you know, for me to be here today. And so I'm happy they did. I mean, ultimately, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. But it doesn't make the story not complicated. It doesn't make it, you know, not painful when you have all these people in your DNA database with this last name. That's the slave owner's last name. And you may carry that last name. It has absolutely nothing to do with you, you know? So yeah, it's a lot of teasing out feelings, emotions, and ultimately for reparations, I think that has everything to do with, you know, what I'm going to talk about in next month in this presentation I'm giving of my ancestors who were enslaved in Dixon, Tennessee at the iron furnaces, and for hundreds of years, and were never paid for that. That's a bigger story, and that has nothing to do with their ancestral makeup, you know. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have hit our time. It is 7:31, so I'm sorry I won't be able to get to the other questions, but I want to thank all of you for attending this webinar, and I especially want to thank Victor and Anneliese and Lisa for sharing their insight on the Department of Justice report about the Tulsa Race Massacre. We will try to we've recorded this session. We will make it available. I believe, Ebony, we can send the link out to people. They'll be able to access it. But again, thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Leslie.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.